Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Publics at IIHS lecture series. My name is Sudeshna Mitra, and I'm the Associate Dean of the School of Economic Development here at IIHS. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Ian Cook, today. Ian is an anthropologist whose research focuses on urban India, scholarly podcasting, opening up higher education for displaced learners, and environmental injustice. He's currently a research fellow at ICAS MP, which is the Center for Advanced Studies funded by the German Federal Ministry of Education and Research, located in Delhi. There he is working on a book about rhythm, urban change, and life every day in Mangaluru. He's also a member of the Allegra Lab editorial collective and a volunteer at the Open Learning Initiative in Budapest. His previous books, and he has several, includes Podcast or Perish, Peer Review and Knowledge Creation in the 21st Century, co-written with Laurie Beckstade and Hannah McGregor, Scholarly Podcasting, Why, What, How, and the edited volume, Opening Up the University, Teaching and Learning with Refugees. From June 2025, he will be a Marie Curie Fellow at Dublin City University. Today, he will be speaking on rhythm, urban change, and life every day in Mangaluru. So, without giving more of a background, over to you, Ian.
Oh, the light is in my eye. Yeah, thank you very much, Sudeshna, and for the invitation and a chance to be here. I was very happy to be back in IIHS. I was a fellow here in 2016 when there was rumors about becoming a university, and now it seems these rumors are true, and it will become a university. So that's really great to be at such an august institution at this momentous time. So I am going to talk, as Sudeshna said, about rhythm and life every day, rather than saying everyday life, maybe we'll come on to that, in Mangaluru, which is a city I've been doing anthropological fieldwork in on and off since 2011. It was never really my plan to keep doing research, but it just kept happening, which is nice. I want to start with a story. Most of my data is stories, right? I'm an anthropologist, and then I will try to make a case for why thinking about the city rhythmically is interesting in terms of how we might want to start analyzing what urban change is doing to life in a city which is maybe a smaller city transitioning into a medium-sized city or something like this. And I would also probably critique all these size-based categories as well. So let me start by telling you a moment that I had when I was doing field work in about 2012. I was driving home from one interview and I saw that Mangalore Town Hall. For those people who don't know Mangalore, I guess everyone in the room does, but maybe some people online are not familiar with the context. It's a city of about about 750,000 people in coastal Karnataka, the state where we also are now. Now we're in Bangalore. Mangalore's on the coast. And I was driving past Mangalore Town Hall and I saw they had a Carnatic music concert. And I'm really interested in Carnatic music, partly because I didn't really understand it. And I went in there and I sat down and I started listening. The concert was going on. And then as I sat down, these two guys turned around and faced me and said, Namaskara, and then started asking me how I was, if I'd had my lunch, and I realized, where do I know these guys from? And then I remembered, these two brothers are traveling astrologists, and I'd met them about 3 months before at Panambur Beach. Panambur Beach is in Mangalore. It's just north of the city, next to a big port, basically, an all-weather port. And I'd met them just after I got out the water. I'd gone there actually to speak to the manager of Panambur Beach, because it was one of the first privately managed beaches in India. So I was interested in what sort of like the private management of public space would be, and he was busy doing his management, so I went for a swim. And as I was coming out, I was trying to get changed while everyone was staring at me, and then these two astrologists were pushed towards me by one of the lifeguards, thinking it was funny, and they said, "Hey, give that guy a reading, tell him he's the future." And I was like, no, I don't want it, leave me alone. And then I finally got dry, and then I was like, actually, I want to speak to these guys. This is really interesting, because the different groups of people in the city that I was doing research with to try and understand the city as it was changing. One of them was housing and land brokers. I'll talk a little bit about that. The other group was auto rickshaw drivers, and again, I'll talk about them. And the third group was moving vendors, people who were going around the city selling certain things. And at first, I didn't think, astrologists don't fit into that. But I'm actually, yeah, they do fit into that. They're going around selling astrology to people. So then I came to the guys and said, hey, would you mind if I, with all my best charm, like, would you mind if I could come round with you the next days? I'll go door to door with you. It'll be really great. I won't get in your way, this and that, and so on. And they said, no. And I said, okay, well, that's that, whatever. But now I'm sitting there in this Carnatic music concert, and they've turned around and said hello to me. So I'm like, this is fate. It's written in the stars. So I'll try again. So I asked them, and this time they said yes. And then we got pushed out of the concert because we were making too much noise, and the audience was saying, shh, be quiet. So I went with them, and I spent the next day and a half walking around the city with them. And it was fascinating, as it was always fascinating for me to be with these door-to-door sellers as they were going around the city and interacting with different people. For example, one of the people that stopped us actually was a doctor who just was driving past on his motorbike, and he came, and it was surprising because the doctor turned out was Muslim, and wasn't usual to have a Muslim guy seek astrology, which is basically a Hindu type of astrology. But he was really upset because the girl he was in love with had just announced basically that she was getting engaged to somebody else, and he wanted to know from the astrologists what would happen. Will this girl come back to me, or will she be married to somebody else? And the astrologist did his reading, did his forehead, did his palms, and told him, don't worry, it's going to be completely fine. And then he said, okay, but I'll take your number, and if you're wrong, I'm going to call you up because I'll be really, really upset. And the astrologist said to me, after he'd gone, they said, well, we'll be in a different town by tomorrow, so it's not really massively important. We won't get spotted. And I said, okay, that's fine. Anyway, we went around the city, we went to lots of different places. They were not super successful in Mangalore. They got a lot of cynicism from people. And at the end of the second day, they were going up to the bus station because they were going to leave to a different town. And they said, okay, now it's our time to do your reading. We're going to have to read now your forehead. And I said, what would be better? And I got very excited again. I said, wouldn't it be great if you could tell me the future of the city? Tell me what Mangalore is going to be. Do a reading of Mangalore. And he looked at me very seriously and said, Ian, don't be stupid. This is not a made-up thing. This is real science, and we can't just do something for the city. We'll just have to do your forehead, and that's it. So I said, okay. They read my forehead. They told me that, firstly, I have a great forehead, and they also told me that I will study for a very long time, and it will lead to a big reward. So I'm still waiting for the big reward. Also, that I will own property in a country that's not my own, which is actually true, and some other stuff. Anyway, about having children and this and that and so on. Anyway, I left them, but I really started to think, okay, I've met these guys at this Carnatic music concert. I come to the city to start to think about rhythm and change. Why should I only be thinking about rhythm in terms of whatever urban theory I'd been reading before I got here? Wouldn't it be maybe a little bit more interesting to start to take seriously the vocabulary and terminology of Carnatic music to try and see if I can combine that with some sorts of urban theory to try and say something a little bit different about the city. The reason why, and I should just say this, I'm not in any way suggesting some exoticizing, orientalizing thing like Indians in cities are dancing around as if they were Bharatanatyam dancers or something like this. No. And I'm also not saying that because music is from a certain part of the world that could be easily mapped onto a city. That would also be stupid. Rather, it's about trying to enliven some of the deadened debates within urban theory by bringing in fresh and different vocabulary. So that's how I started to think through urban change with a little bit of help from Carnatic music. Okay, so a little bit more, before we get there, a little bit of context about what I'd found from going back to Mangalore so many times. So when I was first there for 18 months from 2011 September till 2013 end of the monsoon or middle of the monsoon, and at that time, it really felt like there was a lot of anticipation in the city, that the city was on the cusp of becoming something wonderful. People would, for example, point out to me how great it was that they had city centre shopping mall, this big shopping mall in the centre of the city. I remember once asking an auto driver, how do you know the city is developed? He said, oh, look at that, city centre shopping mall, it's amazing. And I would ask him, but do you ever go there? And he said, well, no, I don't go there. It's not for me. It's for young middle class people. Not for me, but still it was seen as this sign of wonderful development and what was there. And there was lots of new high-rises coming up, and lots of people who owned land. And quite a lot of people did own land because the land reforms were relatively successful in Dakshina Canada. So lots of people had small pockets of land, were selling them to developers and making some decent amount of money. And I visited Mangalore 4 more times, so again in 2016, and then again in 2018, and then finally now 2024 and a little bit of 2025. And really, for a lot of people I spoke with, that anticipation had sort of deadened, and it'd rather become more of an acceptance, and more of like, okay, this is how things are. And how things are were lots of traffic jams, not as bad as Bangalore, but in some parts of the day, in some parts of the city, it was getting like that. Lots of trees being cut down to make way for roads to be widened. Unaffordable property, which often sat empty, but people could no longer afford to live in these high-rise houses. And from some people, they did get angry. So like environmentalists got angry. Environmentalists would point out to me that the Clean City Survey, which is done every year by the Ministry of Environment or something. Mangalore used to be about 60th place when it started in 2000, whenever it was 16, 17. Now Mangalore is down to like 332nd place or something like this. And it's just continued gone down year on year on year. And it is true, Mangalore is dirtier. Mangalore has less trees, so it's hotter. Mangalore has worse traffic. Mangalore has much more expensive food than it used to have, which is also strange because it could come from the surrounding area because it's a fertile land, but actually it's being imported from across the Western Ghats and other places. And so a lot of people, apart from the environmental activists who are angry and complaining, a lot of other people are a bit more of like an acceptance. Okay, this is what big city modern life is, at least on the model which has been exhibited in cities which they knew, like, for example, Bangalore. But I think there's something maybe more interesting to say than just people complaining or also to say it's some sort of linear trajectory that this has to be the case. So I started to think about how can I explain this analytically through rhythm, because I think it could be, can we say something about this? And this is why I've said life out of sync. So to broadly paint my argument at the start, and then I'll come back and pick it through, I would say that what the process of urbanisation is doing in Mangalore, as it's moving from a smaller, medium-sized city into something else, is it's putting life every day a little bit out of sync. People's domestic routines, bodily routines, religious routines, with their work routines and so on. In the past, it was more easy for people to be able to align these in their everyday life. But as the city is expanding, concentrating, and differentiating itself, these different rhythmic patterns that relate to different spheres of people's life are being pulled a little bit out of sync. And in response to this, people are trying to find regularity within the city. And this is becoming a little bit more difficult. I'll skip past that because I'm talking too much. All right, so a bit more of an ethnographic example to maybe sort of ground a little bit what I say, and then I'll talk a little bit about how Carnatic music can help us. So I spent a lot of time with flower sellers in Mangalore, and the flowers that were sold for the Pushpanjali, for the puja, most mornings in shops and in people's homes, but not only, used to be done by local Catholic ladies for a very long time. And the flowers that used to be sold were local flowers taken from the flower farms up near Udupi. But their businesses were very successful. They sent their children to college, and their children said, there's no way we're doing street work, we're going to do something else, right? Work in an office or migrate to another city. This job of selling flowers door to door has been taken over by groups of guys, nearly always guys, but there are a few women, from villages around Mysore. If you ask them their caste, they'll tell you they're SC, so Dalit. And some of them live in the city and have moved their families there, but most of them travel up and down between the villages. It's about 7 or 8 hours on the bus. And they used to sleep in lodges around the bus station that were relatively cheap, but with the rising prices, now they can't afford to do that, so now they just sleep on the street around where they sell flowers, around a shopping center there. And it's interesting in terms of housing, because it also used to be the case they could go door to door to sell their housing, to sell their flowers at the garden gates of people. But as I said, there's a lot of high-rises coming up in Mangalore, so that changes the way you can sell, right? Because there's no longer a garden to sell, and you're not going to go up to the 15th floor to sell someone 30 or 40 rupees worth of flowers. Plus, there's no way they can hear you coming up and down. And a lot of this housing development which has taken place because a lot of people have been able to sell their housing to a developer, or they actually, that's not the right way to say it. They've done joint developments with real estate developers to build this sort of housing. So this was family land. They've come together. Sometimes the land was divided between different siblings. They've come together. They've sat down with a developer. They've come to an agreement that after they built a certain building, they would get a certain amount of floors. The developer would get a certain amount of floors, and so on. So even though sometimes people would say, oh, now we live in a nuclear family and not in a joint family situation, actually it's almost like a joint family. It's just that everyone's in a different flat inside the same building, which is also, I think, pretty interesting. With the development of all these housing, so much of the green space of Mangalore in the last 30 years has disappeared. And I think this is also interesting in terms of thinking about a smaller city like Mangalore that hasn't really had any planned parks. It has one park, Kadri Park, which I'd say is worthy of the name of being a park. The rest have tiny little spots. And when I speak to people who are older people, like people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, they said, but there was never any need to have parks in Mangalore because Mangalore was a collection of villages, up until really the 90s, a collection of villages with paddy fields in between. And so that was the green space of the city. That was the lungs of the city, but it was also the drains of the city. These paddy fields were where all the water went during the very heavy monsoon, which is from June through to the end of August. And now all of these paddy fields, and I say all because one of the popular local sports in Tulu Nadu, the cultural region where Mangalore is a type of buffalo racing, Kambla. And that used to take place in the city. There used to be a Kadri Kambla where people would race their bulls in the middle of the city. The last one of them I saw was in 2012, and now it can only be found outside. And even the paddy fields, which are really wet, so wet that when some builders tried to build on them, the buildings went wonky. Still other builders still think it's profitable enough to dig deep enough into that ground to make sure that these houses can be built on. And as I said, it's very, very hard to get statistics on this, like what's the occupancy rate. They're completely sold out, but the occupancy rate, the builders will never tell you, but you can just stand outside them and look at night, and they look about 30% occupied. And that doesn't mean that people don't own them really. Often they're NRIs who bought them for investment, and maybe people from Mangalore, but they're there. But there is one big plan to create public space in the city, and that's to create a promenade along the riverfront. This has been an on and off discussion for a long time. At one point it was called Mangalore Corniche. Now it has a different name, and it's meant to be realized under the Smart City mission, and wanted to make a promenade basically going along the front of the river, and basically between the two bridges. And it still hasn't been realized, but some land has been cleared for it. And I made a walk along there just March. I tried to walk along where it would be. And I was speaking to one guy who's an engineer in a shipyard, and he said, it's a completely bizarre plan. It doesn't make any sense. Firstly, you can't use it during the monsoon. You can't use it during the summer because it's too hot. So maybe a few months a year you could use it because they want to build a cycle path and a promenade and these things. And he said, and at night you can't really use it. And then this is also something which you'll find people talking about online, because I join all these Mangalore forums. So like on Reddit forums, people will often ask, oh, where can I take a girl like for a date in Mangalore? And then people will say, why are you asking this? Are you from the Bajrang Dal? Do you want to know the secret places we take girls and come and beat us up? People will respond like this. And other people will say, okay, that's one problem. The other problem is if you're out at night, so if they make this promenade and you go and hang out at night, then you might be in a situation in which the actual police, not the moral police, would come and ask you what you're doing and send you home. So Mangalore has a strange feel, not strange, I shouldn't say strange. Mangalore has an interesting feeling when it comes to age, because you've got a lot of young people there, because you've got a lot of colleges. You've got a lot of old people there, because people retire there. But from about sort of 25 onwards, a lot of people leave. There's not like jobs for people who've been educated and want to be working in IT or this sort of sector, so they go to Bangalore or Mumbai or Chennai. And a lot of people, even people who aren't college educated, or a lot of people in Mangalore will look for work in the Middle East and maybe work there for 10 or 15 years and then come back. So there's college-age kids, and then there's sort of a gap. Of course, not everybody. So this sort of generational gap in the city. Right, so I've talked a lot about all these sort of practices that are taking place, how to think about this in terms of rhythm and urbanization. So this is the first thing I want to borrow from Carnatic music, and that is about how to state the relationship between the process of urbanization and the everyday cycles, the everyday patterns within the city. And And how I've tried to think about it is that maybe we can think about urbanization in terms of the relationship here, in terms of Laya or speed, as we might want to translate it, and Tala, the sort of the rhythmic cycles in the city. I'm not saying urbanization is just speed, and I'm not saying the city is just a Tala or a collection of Talas. I'm talking about the relationship between these two. So we think about a very popular theory of urbanization from about 10 years ago, Brenner and Schmidt's planetary thesis of urbanization, not the whole of it, but just one part of it. They talk about how urbanization is a process of concentration, pushing lots of things together, of differentiations, parceling out one bit of land for another bit of land, and expansion. Not only expansion of the city, but also expansion of the markets that serve the city. And so if we think about this triadic dialectical process, and it's driven by different types of capital, right? There's lots of local capital in Mangalore, like the beady industry and so on. That's investing a lot in different things, shopping malls and so on. There's regional capital, like, Infosys have a big campus there. And of course, around the special economic zone and the port, there's plenty of global capital, which is also shaping there. But even though these are different types of capital, still this process of concentration, differentiating, and expanding is taking place. So what it's done, and maybe we'll just talk then about the case here of flower sellers, we can see about how it's creating, this is now we're talking about the relationship between Laya and Tala, how Laya creates the time and the space within a rhythmic cycle for things to take place, right? So it's a space for the patterns, but also the timing of those patterns, because it sees how many times things can take place in there. And if you have a situation where you have lots of different rhythmic cycles, which you have in a city, right? Lots of different routines, lots of different patterns, and these are being timed and spaced differently by this process of concentration, differentiation, and expansion, then you can see how these start to pull one another out of place, whether it relates to your body, whether it relates to your work, and so on. So let me just give an example from auto drivers. So auto drivers would often tell me that one of the biggest problems they face is with stomach cramps. And that's because it was hard for them to say exactly when they were going to have lunch. It actually surprised me how important it was for people to always have lunch at exactly the same time every day. Be at 12:30 or 1 or whatever that is. And they would even say they've been to the doctors about it, and the doctors have advised them, they should be eating biscuits or drinking water or these sorts of things. And so I got interested in thinking about how these bodily patterns and eating patterns and domestic patterns would fit together. So I started also to interview the families of rickshaw drivers, because often the rickshaw drivers are not doing their cooking. And I was speaking to one family, a Catholic family who had a place just outside the city. And so when I started to ask them about their everyday life, and the lady, she worked as a domestic help. And she was telling me that, okay, she'll do all the cooking in the morning, but sometimes he would leave in the morning before she's finished all the cooking, and then try to come back, and then mess with his food like this, and she was sort of blaming him. So then I started to ask about, okay, what are the cooking routines in the household, and how does that relate to, for example, your community and so on? And she said, well, actually, it's interesting that all the Catholic ladies in Mangalore that she knows don't go to Mass on a Sunday, because that's the day they need to cook for the family. So the ladies' day to go to Mass would be the Saturday, and the cooking day would be a Sunday, and all the families come. I said, okay, that's interesting. Let me ask about what also other cyclical practices take place in terms of food. And as we started talking about festivities and eating and so on, and for the Catholics of Mangalore, and I don't know how common this is in other parts of India, you can tell me, is that because most of them were converted by the Portuguese in Goa, but then kicked out of Goa because they didn't give up all of their Hindu practices, and then they came down to Mangalore, that they still follow every September the 8th, Monty Festival, a celebration of Mary, and they have a harvest festival, which is a vegetarian festival. So Catholics having a vegetarian festival, which doesn't really fully make sense in any sort of logic, every September. So this is like a rhythmic practice which is left over from before they were converted, which is still existing a few hundred years later in the city. I said, well, that's also really interesting. What about, then I started to ask about midnight mass, because that's of course another celebration and so on. And it turned out that this year in Mangalore, so Christmas 2024, midnight mass wasn't at midnight. Midnight mass was at 8 o'clock in the evening. And that's because the local authorities couldn't guarantee the safety of Catholics who wanted to all be out at night from maybe being attacked by right-wing Hindu forces. And I thought, that's really interesting. So you've got here a situation where I would have thought that a religious cycle would be so strict that it couldn't actually be interfered with by questions of politics and so on, but it is in the same way. And we can also think about the same way that rhythms and interact with these sorts of questions around communities inside housing. And I'm sure it's the same everywhere, but very often the housing brokers would be telling me that their job, when they're doing their job well, is to make smooth and flowing the relationship between the buyer and the seller, or the landlord and the person who's renting, and that would be to align either what they were told or what they assumed were the preferences in terms of caste, community, gender, and so on. And sometimes this would just be very blunt. So people just say it to the broker's face. They would just say, listen, I don't want any of this community, or I don't want any of that community. Other times it would just be like, listen, we can't have any biryani cooking because that's going to disturb the neighbors, which everyone understands what that means, what that's code for. And the brokers, even when I pushed them on this and said, oh, that's not really very fair, that's not very nice, they said, listen, it's not up to us. Our job is to do our job well, and if that's what people want, then that's what, this is what people want. And it was interesting in terms of thinking about rhythm, because they didn't want friction. They didn't want there to be anything slowing down their business. Brokers were interesting because I somehow imagined before I did research with brokers, they would just be these guys sitting there constantly on the phone, maybe always online and doing this sort of wheeling and dealing. But actually it was a very physical job as well, because they would always be out there searching in the city, searching for land, going down to the train station at the start of the academic year, picking up students, putting them in paying guests, and this is sort of work that went on. And it's interesting how they were pushing to find rhythms even though there wasn't an obvious rhythm in their life. And then I compared this with the moving vendors in the city. And the moving vendors, I was expecting would always be open to new business. But actually that's not the case at all. Because for the sellers of flowers, for the sellers of coconuts, pushing their carts around, that they had a set route that developed over a long period of time. And if you wanted to make them divert from their route slightly, it would have to really be worthwhile for them to do it economically. So sometimes they're walking around, let's say with the flowers on their head, calling out, and then they would stop, oh, do you want this? And then sometimes people would call them down, they would, come on, come down, and they would walk a small diversion, maybe sell, promise to come back the next day, and then tell me, we're never coming back there, it's too far, it takes up too much of our time. So in this case, again, the rhythmic practice of these guys would be not always to want to be found in the city, also to sometimes just to slip through. So this is how I started to think about it again in terms of help from Carnatic music. If you are to analyze drummers' playing styles in Carnatic music, sometimes they're told that they play with a bit more flow. In those cases, you can't really, they sort of fit with the Tala, with the rhythmic cycle which is going on, and you can't really strongly notice the playing style which is going on. But if someone decides to play with a bit more calculation, then you start to notice that drumming style a little bit more. And this isn't a binary, it's more of a continuum. But I think it's interesting, for example, when you think about the ways in which these different groups of people that I've talked about decide to either maybe flow with the city, decide to actually, okay, we will just do as well as we can with what's happening around us, and sometimes make the conscious decision, actually, we need to stick out a little bit more. We need to actually try to do we need to sort of invest in a rhythmic practice, which is going to get us noticed, which is going to allow us to do something a little bit different. What about when you combine all these rhythmic cycles and rhythmic practices together? Because I've mentioned so far that you've got all these rhythmic cycles, these routines relating to the body, relating to the weather, relating to your work, relating to the family, relating to your religious practice. Then you have all these different rhythmic practices, the things that people do with more or less flow. So I started to think, okay, so what's the rhythmic feel of the city? And there's a strong tendency, I think, in recent years, not just in urban theory, but in social theory, to start to talk about lots of things assembling or entangling or some other sort of spatial metaphor. And it really annoys me because I think they sort of get to a certain point. They say, okay, yeah, look, a city is an assemblage of, and a big, big long list. And I'm like, okay, yeah, but so what, right? What do you say next with that? Like, what's the analytical purchase there? And so I said, okay, so what would then be the rhythmic shape of Mangalore? And when you're introducing an idea in Carnatic music, often you introduce an idea through a different shape or pattern or yati. And there's 6 sort of standard ones. And the one that I thought fitted most well for Mangalore is that of the widening river. Slowly getting bigger and bigger and bigger, that sort of feeling of expansion. That's the feeling I got, the rhythmic feeling I got from Mangalore, because there's a certain inevitability to what's happening. Now, I don't think that's really true. I'm not arguing that's definitely going to happen, but this is certainly what I got from speaking to people, that this inevitability of growing and growing and widening and widening. But of course, Mangalore is not just one rhythmic pattern, it's a polyrhythmic ensemble of different rhythmic patterns that when they come together, create this particular rhythmic shape. And people who are in the city, not just anthropologists like me, but people who are going around their everyday life, have to learn this city, learn all the different rhythmic patterns, learn all the different rhythmic cycles to try and act in a way which is beyond just your everyday practice or beyond just responding to these different rhythmic cycles. So the third and final thing I want to talk about is learning. So here's a, I made this before lunch today, this slide. So here's the final thing I want to talk about, learning. So here's the sort of ethnographic example that I hope will give it a bit of purchase. So there was one broker, and every single day he would wake up super early in the morning, do his morning routine at home. He was from the Gauda Saraswat Brahmin community. He would do some praying at home, and then he would take 2 different buses to always be at the same temple every single morning, the Mangla Devi temple. And then he would do his worship there. Then he would take exactly the same bus after that to a hotel, a restaurant in the city. And then he would have his morning breakfast there. Then he would go home. He would do all his calls and so on. And then he would go and to another restaurant for lunch and then this and that. And I was like, why do you have such a fixed schedule? And he said, well, firstly, like he lived alone. He said, firstly, as a guy who's living alone, it makes me feel actually comfortable just to be having this sort of schedule to do stuff. I feel happier doing this. And then secondly, he said, everyone knows who I am in all of these different places. So if I want to be a successful broker, then being in the same place at the same time every day, first of all, allows people to know, oh, he's the broker. So if anyone comes and asks, okay, then that's that person. But it also gives him some sort of reputation. Because the people who have places to go and places to be, and people who are in the same sort of places over and over again, give off the reputation they actually have a purpose, that they're actually doing something. Whereas people who are aimless don't. This is how he explained it. And I think he's relatively right in this case. And from the opposite example, which I think is very interesting, is rickshaw drivers. Because as I mentioned, there are times the rickshaw drivers really want to work, right? Like the busy parts of the day, like the lunch period or the morning period and the evening period. But actually, rickshaw drivers can make their own schedules, right? Like they need to make money, but apart from that, there's no one telling them you have to work at that time. And what was very interesting was that once they'd learned, and most rickshaw drivers would learn this quite quickly, the times of the day they need to work to be most profitable, then there were always these other times of the day from which they could do other stuff. And so this was the time when they would do maybe some like family admin, maybe pick up a relative and take them somewhere else, or maybe pick up some stitching of their wife's sari from somewhere else. Or if they'd made enough money that day from their daily targets, because rickshaw drivers often would have a daily target that they wanted to make each day, then they would just stop working. They would say, all right, let's go to a cockfight, or let's go to the wine bar. There's no wine in a wine shop, but a beer and whiskey, and then carry on working in the evening. Or sometimes people would say, okay, actually, you know what, I've worked, even though I finished my working day, even though it's 6 o'clock or 7 o'clock in the evening and I've made enough money, I'm still just going to put my rickshaw aside and sit at the stand and talk with my friends, because actually this was an important part of male sociability there as well. So how to think about this in terms of rhythm, I think is interesting, because I think, and here I'm drawing on sort of the anthropology of work, people like Dobler, and they're talking about how rhythm and learning of a rhythm, not only the particular task, but also being able to choose in your working day your periods of activity and your periods of rest are a way of expressing agency over the work that one does. I don't know how many of you here have ever worked in a factory. I worked in a factory for a couple of summers, and one of the most alienating things about it is that you really have no control over your time at all. Right? I know academics, those of you who are unlucky enough to be academics, like to complain all the time about, oh, we're so busy, we're so busy. But actually one of the nice things about working in academia is, apart from when you have meetings or teaching, which I know is quite a bit of time, people actually allow you to do what you want when you want to do it. And that is an expression of agency. And I think that's like one of the nice things. And it's the same what many of the auto rickshaw drivers said, that their jobs had large degrees of freedom. But to get that freedom, first you had to learn the city. You had to be able to use the different rhythmic patterns of the city to earn enough money for that day, to make sure you're in different parts of the city where you know there's going to be work, and so on. But these are sort of the everyday expressions of agency through rhythmic acts. But I think also there is a certain degree of improvisation. How am I doing for time? 5 more minutes, I'll talk. Okay. And because this is really the final thing I wanted to talk about. And so when we think about improvisation, I actually wanted to think about it seriously. There are like people who talk about improvisation almost in a metaphorical way, but if you think about the way improvisation works in music, definitely in Carnatic music, but it can also be in other music, it's a very structured form of improvisation if you want that improvisation to actually be legible and understandable and appreciated by others. Usually in the sort of standard classical way a Carnatic music concert works. Towards the end there's an extended drum solo, and there's certain rules within that with certain ideas or certain like structure to that, but at the end of that piece of music then everyone comes in together, all the musicians come back, there's a repeated motif, and that's the sort of like the grand finale or this great moment of the concert. And I was thinking about that. What that means is that improvisation is this very social, relational and legible thing for it to make sense. I'll give you an example from a flower seller. So this was back in 2000, I want to say 16, and he had come up with a scheme way before UPI and GPay and anything like this, so that he didn't have to deal with cash. So if you imagine the rhythm of when you need to do the puja in the morning with your flowers, most people who are doing it at home, they want to have it after their bath in the morning, right? But then the shops don't open till 10 o'clock. So how to deal with this, that on your route you have shops and you also have people at home. So what he did was he just started leaving all of the flowers in plastic bags on the shutters of the shops and came to an agreement with the shop owners that they would pay him once a month into his bank account that he'd set up for this purpose. And I thought, what a great way to understand the city, to rhythmically understand the city, and then to improvise within that in a way which is legible and understandable to other cities. Maybe my final point I want to make in terms of rhythm is that it's not only on this everyday scale, but also relates to how people think about projects in their life in relationship to the city. Often people would think about ways in which they could use the city or live in the city as part of their wider life project. This guy who you're seeing quite a lot is a coconut seller from a village in Tamil Nadu, and he worked pretty much away from his family his entire life. And his plan was that when it got to 2020, he would retire from working in Mangalore, where he sells coconuts and also worked as a head loader in the central market, then return to be with his family, because that would be the time when his children would have finished college. So this is a guy who is pretty much relatively illiterate, worked in this manual labor job his entire life. Both of his children are now college educated. And he was able to do this because he was able to predict pretty much correctly how the city would be able to reward him for all of this work and so on. It fell to pieces slightly because of demonetization and because of COVID. Basically, that messed with his plan. So he's still working in the city, but he says this is his last year in the city. So he's sort of 5 years behind plan because of this big, mess in his life. But but this is like this particular coconut seller. But in general, what I've noticed is a lot of people who had certain expectations of the city, because of this process of urbanization which is taking place, the city is becoming less predictable. It's becoming less expectable. So because of the increasing house prices, these sorts of guys, the guys who are these door-to-door sellers, or otherwise what we might want to call the working poor, often can no longer afford to stay even the cheapest accommodation in the city. This is why now the flower sellers are sleeping on the road instead of staying in the lodges. And, or they stay a really long way outside the city in the countryside. That's in the end what he did. Like he was like way up, maybe like 45 minutes travel out of town, but that's an extra 45 minutes there and back during your day. And so these sort of predictability of the city is shrinking for many people. With the auto rickshaw drivers, it's also the case because the arrival of electric autos, which are messing with many systems are in place in terms of the amount of autos in the city, so the amount of fares you can expect, plus the buying and selling of permits. So this process of taking away the predictability and the expectancy in everyday life is also messing with people's ability to imagine projects into the long term and into the future. All right, this is pretty much what I've just argued. I won't go through it all because that's the sort of very abstract way for it to be there. Or is it useful to go through it or not, or we discuss? Then I won't really go through it, but basically I have tried to argue, and I'd love to get feedback from you, because this is how I'm trying to frame this, especially if you're an expert in Carnatic music, which I'm not. I've been trying to frame thinking through the city, but I've been arguing that there's been a desynchronization of these everyday cycles within the city, these different routines, that people have tried to develop different rhythmic practices in relation to this, in ways that seek for regularity, but also move between flow and calculation as people know and understand the city. Also, this has formed together into a particular rhythmic shape, the shape of a widening river in Mangalore, and this is learned through repetition. I actually didn't talk much about learning through repetition, but often I think people think that repetition is a very sort of mechanical or metronomic-like way of learning. But if you look at the way learning takes place in classical music, in classical Indian music, but elsewhere, actually it's repetition that can actually enable creativity once you've mastered a particular step or way of playing or so on. And they can allow for, once you've learned the city, the expression of certain rhythmic acts that can display agency. And also, as people improvise, thinking about how to do different things, then move on to thinking about how projects can be imagined with and through the city. But this is becoming a little bit muddied and a little bit more difficult, exactly because of this process of urbanization, which is desynchronizing things in everyday life in Mangalore. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that. There was so much to, there was so much to engage with in terms of the stories and the everyday lives of the people that you spent more than a decade with, off and on, going in the field. But also kind of stepping back and sort of thinking about this. And I think like from personally, like one of the things that I liked a lot was, I think when we talk about rhythm or a lot of the language that exists in urban theory around this, I mean, there's this idea of speeding up or, concentration, etc., which at one level sort of abstracts and generalizes and feels more like a flourish that, can hold a lot of places, but doesn't say a lot in terms of how is that place moving, how is that place changing. So what I liked was that in breaking down the idea of rhythms and patterns across all of these different words, in this case, sort of taking it from Carnatic music, but just the sort of the role as, as somebody who's theorizing, the approach to that is almost sort of holding a lens or a moment and then sort of looking at it from all these different angles and then seeing how these different pieces are sort of interacting with each other. So in some ways, it's like not just the rhythm, they're not just like these separated things, but in some ways you're making maybe a sentence out of them. Like you can put them together and it kind of comes together in a sentence. So I really like that kind of an approach to theorization. So thanks for that. I will take this thing of being the moderator to ask the first question. And then I will open it up to the Q&A and maybe we can look online as well. But I wanted to kind of go back to what you started telling us, right? That anticipation has turned to acceptance across a lot of the stories in the way that urbanization has played itself out. You also sort of ended by talking about desynchronization, right? So just holding these two things together and bringing it back to some of the ways in which we talk about people think about their life in the city in terms of their social mobility, in terms of, you know, how they're, like the example of the coconut seller that you left us with, like this planning that they do of how the city will reward them in the way that they move forward. But I want to ask a little bit of a different question and say, what role, like how can we think about this new vocabulary that you're, you know, telling us to think through in terms of these different rhythmic patterns on how they are making and breaking sort of the subjectivity of becoming the urban. And because a lot of these people are also, there are a lot of migrant experiences that are part of this, it's almost like how does the subjectivity of urbanization itself get made or broken by thinking through these different kinds of elements of time, synchronicity, rhythm, patterns that you're telling us about. So if you could reflect a little bit on that, that would be, you know, with this shift from anticipation to acceptance kind of a thing.
Yeah, thank you for the... Thank you very much, Sudeshna, for the question. Super interesting question. Maybe I have two ways of answering it. So one is to think about a little bit in terms of ethics and everyday ethics. So one of the things that I think that a lot of people imagine in the city, and it's certainly in a lot of urban theory, is that as a city grows, there's an anonymity that's there, right? There's this sort of stranger danger which is out there. Because suddenly it's not the case, whereas in the past everyone sort of knew everyone. And it was never really like that in Mangalore, but people do talk a little bit like, you know, 20 years back, everyone could sort of, whatever. As the city is growing and you have got much more in-migration. So Mangalore was, when I first started doing fieldwork, Mangalore was about 500,000 people. Now it's about 750,000 people. So in 15 years, a decent amount of growth. And when you think about it in terms of rhythm, and if you have a regular, everyday seller come to your door, then that repeated engagement, these people aren't necessarily, you know, friends or trusted relations, although the repeated engagements with people who are coming in off the street can sort of mess with this barrier which might be there, caste, class, migrant, city barrier that's there. I was surprised that quite often sometimes people would call their door-to-door sellers of fish inside their house to gut them, or that they would call the flower seller to the wedding. Okay, so it's a big wedding, whatever. But it was still sort of this repeated engagement with the, you know, migrant laboring poor, and it had to be about repetition that had some sort of everyday, not a big ethical question, but an everyday ethical question in terms of like what's going on there. And the second way I would answer that from the other side is that there's a lot of assumptions in the city about who people are, how you place them within some sort of particular subjective category, especially around hierarchies of caste and so on. But as you sort of move from being in a city where there's a less clear local social hierarchy, and because in the past people would really explain to me Mangalore or the wider region of Tulu Nadu in these very clear ways. The Bunts, the Shetties, they were the landlords. The Bilivers, they were the toddy tappers and the farm workers. The Catholics were also landlords quite often. And then people would describe this whole situation like that. That's all sort of changing. And because of that, I think we have to think about subjectivities, how those play out over time, and how these repeated engagements are not quite fully always inside a social structure, but are hinting at it to people. So it's not a naive individualism, but it's not fully engaged, not fully placeable. So sometimes people would like start to ask me about my research, and I would talk, and I would just say something usually quite vague, like, oh, as you know, with urban change, how this is changing things like caste relations, gender, blah, 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 blah. And then people would sometimes tell me, oh, I can tell someone's caste straight away. And so when I was with this door-to-door magazine seller, we had this situation, we were sitting down and we were talking with somebody, and I said, okay, then guess his caste, you know? And he got it completely wrong. Actually, this guy was Brahmin and from pretty well-to-do family, but for some reason wanted to be a magazine seller, wanted to be this guy going around in the street. One of his brothers is a doctor, one is a banker, right? And so it was completely unexpected. And then, but just because of the nature of the job he was doing, this was also changing these things. So I think as a smaller city is experiencing this intense urban change, I think it's really playing with subjectivities, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting, this thing of what is, again, like in a flourish, maybe talked about as a certain anonymization that comes with a city, but you're kind of breaking that down and sort of saying that happens in stages, it's muddied, it's broken, it's got its own patterns as well, but they're not one unified pattern. Thanks for that. So just opening it out to the room, are there any questions for Ian?
Hi, thanks for that. It was really interesting to see some things that we talk about a lot at IIHS, I think, especially as part of the Urban Fellows. We talk about change and urbanization, but then looking at it from a lens of like an art form in particular makes it particularly interesting. For me, I found this lens of the rhythm very useful, and I was making a lot of notes about how it compels you to think differently in many ways. But my question to you is that why is it that you are looking at Carnatic music as the art form over here? Because to my mind, at least, I mean, there's possibly some linkages with caste and structure and things like that. But to my mind, apart from the geographical proximity, perhaps, to this art form, what else were you thinking about when you said Carnatic music?
Yeah, thank you. It's a very good question because most of my interlocutors don't listen to Carnatic music. Apart from those two astrology brothers at the beginning, this is not the music of the laboring poor, right? Because Carnatic music is steeped in caste hierarchies and exclusion and all of these things, 100%. And it could have been a completely different. I could have said, okay, let's take jazz and let's like use jazz and try to understand stuff. But it felt written in the stars because I met these brothers at the event, and then I started to think it through. So I think I wanted to take a vocabulary of a developed, sophisticated way of thinking about rhythm, and Carnatic music has that. And so, but I'm not suggesting at all that because I'm in South India, only Carnatic music could explain stuff. I could have done all of this maybe thinking about some sort of, jazz, right? But then I would have maybe reached different answers, and that would be quite a different project to maybe compare the same city space using many different rhythmic patterns like that. So, I ask you then, like, I don't know how much about Carnatic music you're aware of, but like, do you think Carnatic music has the sort of, rhythmic vocabulary that help us understand, or could I have just picked a completely different form of music completely?
Yeah, I mean, to my mind, I would say any kind of classical music in the Indian context would fit this very well. But I found it interesting that you picked Carnatic music, and also like while you were talking about the relationship of so for example, the broker who is talking about his rhythms of the day, that is itself very caste inscribed, and how that kind of contrasts with the auto drivers' lack of rhythm in their day. And therefore, I think this kind of link I think it's very like full of possibilities to explore this relationship further. So I was interested in that. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right, I will go online then. I'm going to combine two questions because I think it's speaking to. So, Arjama Mukherjee, how would you say one should deal with this shrinking predictability? So that's one. And then Hamantu Ishwar, I hope I'm pronouncing the names correctly. Could the conception of rhythm encompass the distress that confronts the migrant labor while they step into the new land with alien challenges and some adverse effects to the extent that they find themselves losing hope of survival, subsequently either giving up to dark forces or, if lucky, back to their native place?
Okay. So I will answer. I think I should answer them both at once. You think they're the same? I think what I found was, in terms of the second question, like when somebody suddenly finds themselves in a situation where things are very alien or strange, is people searching for this rhythmic pattern. So people, for example, with brokers, people who became brokers, some of them, it's not like an official job to be a broker, right? Like people just decide to become a broker. And some people, the ones who were very successful, I gave this one example now of this particular elderly gentleman who'd done it his whole life. And for him, he was very clear he needed this rhythm to orientate himself. Some of the brokers who were unsuccessful really were just sort of hanging in different places and waiting for something to happen. And they were really actually very, very poor. And they would sometimes get a little bit of a lifeline by being included in somebody else's deal here or there or so on. With the daughter, and they were nearly all local, by the way. Brokers are nearly all local. Auto rickshaw drivers are like 95% local as well. But with the door-to-door sellers, now they are increasingly migrant labor. The difference maybe is fish sellers. Fish sellers are still quite local. But most of the rest of the door-to-door sellers are migrant laborers. And I had the experience of being with a flower seller the day he arrived to the city. So he just arrived because he was part of the wider cast network of these flower sellers from Mysore. And I'd been with one particular flower seller maybe 2 or 3 times on his route, and then he crashed a motorbike he'd borrowed from somebody, and he needed to go back to his village to have some treatment or to rest or whatever. And then I didn't know this, and this guy called me in the morning and said, oh, come, we'll walk the route. And the route starts at 6 o'clock in the morning. So I got there 5:45, ready to start the route, and he said, oh, I can't do it today, I'm injured. This guy, he's just got off the bus, he's my friend, you show him the route. He told me to show him the route. And I was like, what? Like, I can't show him the route. And he said, you've walked it. Like, I said, yeah, I've walked it like 2 or 3 times. I can't really remember the route. But we went off and we went round and maybe I probably showed him like 30% of the route. And throughout that time, I'd say half the people that I showed him refused to sell to him because they said, oh, we only sell to our guy. We only sell to that regular guy. And so I think both of the answers I gave are saying, how do people orientate themselves? How do people deal with the distressing situation they find themselves with? How do people deal with the shrinking sense of predictability? Is to find a regular rhythmic pattern and routine, because that is not necessarily saying a rhythmic, regular routine like pattern is necessarily always a closed and limiting way of imagining one's life. It's actually people who had the ability to forge something regular. That's when they could imagine something a bit more. That's when they could take advantage of the possibilities of the city. That's when they could actually realize particular projects and so on. And I think this is actually becoming increasingly difficult for people because of the things that I spoke about already.
I have a question that kind of follows up from what you just said. Did you find that amongst many things that in social theory we think that people use to make choices about what work they will sort of use the landing infrastructure of their social networks to build out into, but do you think this patterns and rhythms also played a role in how people chose, this is the work that I want to do? How they changed jobs, if they ever did, if you recognized that this kind of work is giving me a rhythm that works better with, whatever their personal life trajectory is. And the second part of the question, so one is that, like, do you think this rhythm is a part of that choice-making thing, if they have any choice or agency on that? And the second part of it is that, how did they speak about the difference between rhythm at home, maybe in rural areas, and the rhythm in the city, and kind of going back and forth between those two?
Yeah, so for the first part, I just give another ethnographic example because it's interesting. The very last auto rickshaw driver I interviewed just now in March, he's qualified as an engineer, and he spent most of his life working in a different part of Karnataka, and then he came back to Mangalore to look after his elderly parents, and his kids had finished college. And he said he wanted to be a rickshaw driver because that gave him the freedom of choosing when and how to work. So he'd put the money that he'd saved as an engineer into buying an auto rickshaw, and then that would give him the freedom of basically working, but also every time he needed to go care for his elderly parents, then he could do that as well. But that's a position of quite privilege, yes. For the door-to-door sellers who came in from outside, I mean, and I guess this is all the way down. Usually, the more difficult socio-economic background of the particular groups, the more constrained their choices were, for sure. And what was like extremely sad, going back to this group of like 10 or 15 flower sellers who I've been known since 2011, many of those had died, and they were not old, like in their 40s. And then when people say, "Oh, what killed them?" What killed them was poverty, but a range of things, like a fever that wasn't treatable, one COVID, one hit by a car whilst in the road working, and the possibility, it's not you're going to be your first choice in the world to be doing this extremely difficult, back-breaking work of walking around in the heat and selling and so on. But this is what people have found, because the rhythm back home, both the coconut sellers and the flower sellers, because these are the real rural urban migrants I did research with, just talked about the fact is that agriculture just wasn't profitable, and or just was non-existent. So for the guys from around Mysore, they just said there wasn't enough irrigation in their land and it wasn't really worthwhile. And then for the coconut sellers, because they're all from the same sort of region, somewhere around Salem, and it was all very much a case of we will find some like very small bits of agricultural work, maybe seasonally, as a retirement, but as a place to live, it was just not possible because there wasn't the work. So.
5 minutes. Okay. Are there any other questions from class? Yeah.
I was quite interested in, your long-term engagement with this research, and just curious to know when you have this kind of long-term engagement, so many years, what did you see as the advantages of that engagement, in the sense that, also connecting to what Sudeshna just said, rhythm in the city and rhythm back home, the rhythms have changed over the years. But also theories, new theories have emerged, literature has changed. How were you, navigating through all of those changes yourself?
It's a great question, and I just want to say it was not planned, right? So basically, I first went there and did research for my PhD. Then I came back and I said, okay, now I'm going to write it up and publish it and whatever. But then I worked on completely different things. I worked for years on scholarly podcasting and what that does to academic knowledge. Then I worked for 3.5 years as the director of studies of a program for refugee students in Budapest. And I always kept telling myself, I'm going to find time to write it up. Was never the case. But what I was quite successful at is writing short research grants to come back and then carrying on doing bits of research, which is what I've just done now. But now I really have to write it up, because otherwise I'll feel terrible personally. So it was not, but it's been a massive advantage, because I think when I first did the research, I was much more optimistic about how Mangalore was changing, because that's what people were. They were optimistic, and I was trying to be critical and this and that. But there was an air of optimism there. Now that I'd say has changed a lot, and I think so that's been super useful to see how this has changed. Also to see how people's personal plans have not been realized. Like, for example, the coconut seller I told you about, because of COVID, because of demonetization, all of these sort of massive distressing factors in life. So that's also been an advantage. In terms of reading and theory, I went, when in December I started working, November I started working again after to do anything to do with urban India for 5 years. And I said, okay, let's catch up with the literature. I actually found it sort of depressing. And I found it depressing maybe because I spent too much time thinking about academic knowledge production because of this podcasting work. But I felt everybody was just trying to find some catchy urbanism. So, I don't want to be mean on all these different types of urbanism, but everyone had a new injected urbanism, Dracula urbanism, blah, blah, blah urbanism. And for full disclosure, I call my PhD expectant urbanism, right? So everyone, and it's just like, but it's just felt so like, okay, let's capture something. And so I felt sort of disappointed also with some of the debates inside urban studies, like the debates between, I don't know, what can we call them, this sort of Marxist or Marxian types, some of whom I referenced, and these sort of assemblage types. And I felt they were not even trying to engage with one another, just to put one another down. And then I was just like, well, that's not really super helpful. Like, I did my undergraduate degree in philosophy, and I was a very bad philosopher, because I think once you start to think about the world, you lose any sort of theoretical purity or coherence, because actually the world is too complex for that. So I actually quite enjoy thinking different theories together, thinking about Marxian theory of how global flows can restructure cities, alongside the very sort of the practice theory, like people like anthropologists like Tim Ingold or sociologists like Stanley Blue, who are very flat ontologies. They can't deal with scale, they can't deal with politics. And then also to think about these more sort of poetic or political acts, like when I was talking about like how people make projects and so on. Thinking those together, maybe dialectically together, I think is quite productive for thinking about a complex social order like a city. So yeah. But yeah, if I don't write this up, I will feel very guilty for the rest of my life. Yeah.
It's something similar to Kiran's question. It's kind of a bit, I just revised it a bit. So it's mostly like, you also spoke about social relationship and legibility and all. So how in this decade of your experience going back and forth to the same city, that repeating and all, how is that legibility changed from your perspective? How did you start? Yeah, from you in that last decade, from the day one. I don't know, like when you started, how fluent are you in Kannada? I don't know, but like now I know you're fluent in Kannada, but the language and all, like how it's not only like how you're looking at the city, but the city is also looking at you parallelly. How that also changed in this decade of time, because you're meeting someone in person. But another one, the second question, which I'm very curious, was you said a really nice pattern about real estate brokers. They always tie up with some institution, like academic is one of the pattern, like students, and like, you know what time they'll come and like what are the blah blah blah. Is there any such kind of another pattern that you found that like, yeah, these are the patterns that are there, like real estate brokers depend on education institutions, college, schools, and like their patterns. Some other sector, like, I don't know, randomly I'm throwing like hawkers, street vendors, do they also have such kind of a pattern of like some festival season or some season? Technically it's student season, if you can say. Like these are the two questions, like what I'm thinking about.
Okay, yeah. I think I'll forget it. Can I have questions back to back? Because there's already two questions, and then I have Jyoti's afterwards. So the second one, so the seasons are still extremely important. Where it's the monsoon, that's very, very important. In terms of the flower sellers, there are auspicious days. The most auspicious day for Lakshmi is Friday, am I right? And so Friday was the busy day for flowers. So seasonal patterns in terms of the climate and the monsoon and so on were very, very important. And then also like, you know, religious moments, religious practice was also then these sort of, at one point I would have called them entraining patterns, because it comes from chronobiology, thinking about how certain rhythms entrain other rhythms. But I don't like this sort of biological metaphors, and combining it with the music metaphor, it got a bit messy. And actually, as I showed with the case of midnight mass for Catholics, those can actually be messed with. I thought those strict religious rhythmic cycles would not be messed with, but they can be, you know, the same way that we seem to have the most important Kumbh, like, is it really written in the stars, or is it politically derived, right? So there's lots of ways in which actually things that seem very set in place, and even the climate, even the monsoon is changing. So like that's also changing over time as well. So I think it's a bit more fluid. And I'll just give you an ethnographic example for how people's relationship change with me. When I first went there, I was a student, right? And I would tell people I was a student. And with the auto rickshaw drivers, they would love to take me to the wine shop for a beer. They would never let me pay. because I was a student and I was an outsider. Then I went away, I got my PhD, became a doctor, came back, then I had to pay. And it's also the same with them. If one of them went to work in the Middle East for a few years and came back, then you have to pay, because you've been working abroad, so now you've got money, right? But before, they knew where I lived, they knew how much rent I paid, and I was just staying in some cheap place. And so that definitely changed. I got older, I was no longer viewed as a student, right? But my Canada got worse, because I wasn't practicing, so yeah.
Am I audible? Yeah, I wanted to ask futuristically, let's say from 10 years, if you look from the lens of a Mangalorean, how would you look back at the city and the urbanization? What predictability do you have for the city? Will they want to come back if they're working outside? Because you told there is an age gap of the people who are living in Bangalore. Like there are youngsters and there are retired people, but with the people who are between 20s and 50s, would they want to come back after 10 years with the urbanization the city is taking in shape?
Yeah, so the question is, I think, about jobs. And so Mangalore has tried multiple times since I've seen it to rebrand itself as Karnataka's second IT hub, right? This has happened sometimes on a state level, they've tried to do it, but also individual businesses have also tried to do it. The last time they did it was just now in December when I was there. They had some meeting and they said, okay, I can't remember what they called it, like the Silicon Coast or something like this, I mean, it's whatever, it's branding, right? But part of the problem they say they face, and I don't know how true it really is because I've not done research with this group of people who left Mangalore and don't want to go back, is that Mangalore has a reputation as not being a fun place in your 20s. There's no party scene, there's no pubs. There's nothing like that sort of thing that you've got in Bangalore that people want from a city. There are a few things here and there, and there are beaches, but at the same time there is this reputation, which is partly true, of moral policing and of also being a conservative city, and that is definitely the case. So if Mangaloreans would stay or would want to come back, it would have to be like far more jobs in the IT sector or that sort of level, which currently don't exist. Infosys has a Infosys-only special economic zone, so there is some stuff there. And Emphasis has a training center, so there are bits and bobs. There is that sort of infrastructure, but it's not really grown. And I think also people want that social infrastructure there as well. And that's just starting to change in a sense that a few of the bars, as an experiment, have been granted a license to be open, I think, until 11 o'clock. And this wasn't the case before. I mean, when I was in Mangalore, I was invited to a party by some students from St. Aloysius College, and we went to some bar on the outside of town, and then together with my wife, and then we left and went home. And just after we went home, apparently then, the moral police turned up and caused a big fuss. So that sort of stuff is there. So I don't know how much that's going to play out. But now when I was there, there were far more examples of, I don't know how to correctly say it. No, Bangalore type, activity. Ladies in skimpy clothing for Mangalore, like in pubs drinking beer, which was much more difficult to see 15 years ago. So there are sort of these changes there as well. Yeah.
Hi. So I was just wondering, this might be a little bit of like out of your inquiry as well, but like since that, like has been like a decade-long interactions and like seen the city, the interactions and all of that, and also you've used the terms from the Carnatic music to sort of explain the social relations and urbanisation and all of that. I'm sort of trying to like turn around that linkage and try to understand, have you noticed how the Carnatic music has changed over the time, like how is the rhythm of urbanization has basically changed the rhythm of Carnatic music over this 10 years or like, because, I think that kind of a linkage back I was expecting, or a little bit, I was missing that. Since you are like rooted in Carnatic music. So if you have any thoughts on that.
Well, I'm not an expert on Carnatic music. I learned, I think it's an interesting question, and one I definitely want to think about. But I was thinking now, I went to see, when I was in Delhi, T.M. Krishna sing, and he was singing Carnatic music based on the poetry of Guru Nayaka, am I right? The social reformer from, you know who I'm talking about, right? And he is somebody who is really trying to mess with ideas of what a traditional Carnatic music concert is, right? He says it shouldn't have this set form. He's calling out caste privilege all the time, and he's trying to bring in then, like, let's use lyrics from social reformers who are anti-caste social reformers and let's set them to music. He sings Christian bhajans and all of this sort of stuff. But that seems to me like a big city intellectual type thing of doing it. So that might be going on in Chennai, I don't know, which I think he's based in Chennai, TM Krishna, right? And in Mangalore, I didn't see that. I was invited from my former teacher, he's also really a singer, to a few different things now when I was back in Mangalore, and they still felt very upper caste, traditional, how to say, sang adjacent, if not completely sangified. And so, but then I spoke to one environmental campaigner who I met at this concert, and I knew her from environmental stuff. And I was putting this to her, I said, how do you fit this together? Like, if you look at all these people around and the politics of people here, and your politics as this, you know, social environmental campaigner, and she said, yeah, but I love this music, why should we give it over to them? Which would be something maybe that TM Krishna would also say. He said, like, this music doesn't belong to the purview of just these types of people. So, and that's not even a great answer, because I don't know for sure. I can't say enough about the music scene in Karnataka, but I think Carnatic music has some people trying to change it, but maybe not necessarily in Mangalore itself. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. Because I was wondering, like, in Delhi, at least, there's like a literature on how the Sufi music, especially in the old Delhi, has changed over the time because of the urbanization and people change their, livelihood so the entire economy of Sufi music, the social relations, everything has changed. So I was thinking, like, what it would be for the Carnatic music. If you're
Yeah, you know, I went to a Bharatanatyam concert just now in January, and in Mangalore, and that was super modern. Like they basically and I don't know enough about Bharatanatyam to know exactly what was going on, but the dancer, she'd taken out some of the traditional stuff and put in stuff like getting a red flag from a guy because he sent like a picture of his genitals to her on her phone and stuff like that. So she was really messing with how to tell a story through Bharatanatyam. So that was going on as well. But she also wasn't from Mangalore, but she was invited to Mangalore by a Mangalorean dancer. One of the groups, one of the things that I didn't really talk about, but I did do research with, was I went to interview all of like the moral police, like the Bajrang Dal and so on, and I went to their events. And one of the ones when I went to there, I saw like so many people from the Carnatic music scene as well. So that's, I think, still quite, that linkage is still quite strong, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on your political point of view.
Yeah, thank you again for your presentation. I am phrasing this question as I'm talking because I'm also fully coming to terms with the idea of the rhythms and structures. So one thing that you mentioned was about how with the urbanization you're able to see Mangalore's rhythm turning into a widening river, and you also mentioned how the rhythm of the city is not singular, it's multiple ones converging, not converging, but multiple rhythms that are simultaneously interrelated and are being affected by each other. So, and are also becoming unpredictable over time. So one question that I had was, if you were to use this, the idea of the rhythm to look at multiple cities, especially multiple cities across India, possibly that are urbanizing at a similar time as Bangalore is, do you think if you had to do that, and especially like given, say, given a few things like the incoming of the internet, or even something like 4 years ago, we had COVID, which has a kind of universal impact over places across time. So do you think this unpredictability that is kind of coming within Mangalore, if you look at it on a larger scale across cities over India, which are in a similar position as Bangalore, then you can see, I don't know, a larger rhythm or pattern emerging. Yeah.
It's another great question, and I don't have any empirical data on that. there are some things that must be specific to each city, right? Mangalore is a coastal city. That's very important in terms of setting the rhythm to the city. Has such a heavy monsoon that also is very, very important. Has all of the right-wing politics I mentioned, which is also very important in setting the rhythms of every day in the city. Every city has a very distinct and unique makeup of caste and community relations, and every city is different like that. One of the problems that urban studies has in South Asia, but elsewhere, is that most people do research in the same handful of 5 or 6 cities. So most urban studies in India is Delhi, Kolkata, Mumbai, whatever. Wouldn't it be great if actually we knew more about cities like Mangalore, of a similar-ish size? So those of you who are like yourself, younger than me and thinking about where to spend 14 years of your life researching, like pick somewhere else. I really picked Mangalore sort of at random. Like I said, okay, like I think at the time it was something like 85th largest city in India, and I thought, well, why not go there and see? It has a beach. I'm going to have to stay there like a year and a half during the PhD, and but it could have been another city just as well, and that would have also, I think, been equally as interesting. I think there is something also there to say about city size, and that is. So size is not just a relative category. I think it's a relational and relative thing. So what's a bigger? It's not big. It's bigger and smaller rather than saying big or small or tier 1, tier 2. All of that stuff matters for funding mechanisms, but certainly matters less sociologically or even in terms of the political economy. And Mangalore, it was decided in the 1970s would have an all-weather port. Because India, after independence, only had a few large ports. So like centrally, it was decided by the central government, okay, we need some more ports. And Mangalore was selected, which makes sense because it's a port city. And it's had its traditional port for as long as anyone has any memory of the city. And that choice is interesting, and I think you can probably see this in other cities, is that centrally, smaller cities are imagined in terms of the political economy to have a niche. Right? So Mangalore's niche then was set in a sense of, okay, we're going to have an all-weather port, which led to the buildup of heavy industry around that, which then also led to the petrochemical Mangalore special economic zone around that as well. So sort of put it on a certain trajectory. So I think with smaller cities, and this is what I know from the literature elsewhere, often they're imagined as fulfilling in the national imaginary a particular niche in terms of their political economy. And so that's certainly something which has affected Mangalore's rhythm, because that's been I'm not necessarily a disruptor, but it's certainly created a particular rhythm of export and trade, which might not have otherwise been there. So I imagine other smaller or medium-sized cities would have similar niche roles, and that would also be a rhythmic setter within the city as well.
I think we'll make this the last question.
Very interesting work. Thank you so much for that. I am still trying to wrap my head around the work that you have done. It's very interesting, and I'll try my best to articulate it I try my best to articulate this, but I have like a 2-part question. One is sort of linked back to the question that Sudeshna asked about subjectivity and how subjectivities are reconfiguring urbanization, and therefore that the relationship between anticipation and acceptance, and that plugging it back to desynchronized life. And the question that was asked about the relationship, the linkages between rhythm and urban change. What's the relationship between looking at it from how Carnatic music vocabularies sort of make you understand rhythm and form and shape, how that speaks to urbanization and urban change. I'm trying to link those and try to bring a little back in terms of, one was, of course, the question of why Carnatic music, because it has more Brahmanical sort of, caste hierarchies in terms of the way you're looking at it. But Mangalore itself could have its own sort of, folk music or any other kind of music that could have been explored. So I was a little curious to understand, how do you see because you mentioned initially, we started out talking about how using the lens of planetary urbanism and how there are some gaps that it has in terms of not being able to articulate what is the sort of analytical purchase that it has. So I was trying to understand how do you see your role, the role of your work, giving a certain language to the subjectivity of people, the people that have been researched, by the kind of language that's coming from the researcher. So how do you see it feeding it back, like the loop feeding itself back? In terms of knowledge production, in terms of subjectivities being sort of reconfigured, how do you see that working out in academia, outside of academia? If you could a little bit on that.
Yeah, thank you. If I understand it well, the question is about if the choice of conceptual vocabulary that I've chosen to use, how that how that feeds back in some sort of loop. That's a really, really good question. I would actually, yeah. So I have presented some of these ideas in Mangalore, and never got such a good question like that. But I think so. In terms of why Carnatic music and not like Tulu folk music, for example, it's partly about the rhythmic sophistication and the language which has already been put there. But again, like I could pick a completely different type of music. Sometimes I wish now I just picked some jazz. All urban theorists just pick something from jazz and use that as a metaphor. But I really didn't want to use rhythm as a metaphor. I really wanted to actually take the vocabulary and interrogate urban theory through the vocabulary. There's what's the guy called who I actually heard talk here, Abdul Malik Simone. He has his book Improvisationary Rhythms, where he just like takes something from jazz music, super clever, super smart, but stays almost at a level of a metaphor. And I said, okay, so I want something where there's a pre-existing rhythmic vocabulary that I can use seriously and not only on a metaphorical level. So that's maybe that there. In terms of this, like I think most academic writing is unfortunately very alienating towards the people it's written about. When I'm trying to write this up in a book form, I'm really, really trying to write lots of intimate stories of the people with whom I did research, so that they don't become just an economic category of the laboring poor in a city or so on, but become all of their full complexity and contradictory nature of whatever their life is. So I think in terms of the writing, most of the time I hope to make people, to write about people in a fully human form. And that's maybe the best we can hope for in social sciences when we write about people. But I don't only work with text, I also work with film. I didn't show any film today, and also do a lot of stuff with audio. And I find that using those mediums is actually maybe a better way to actually connect with the people I'm doing research with. Because let's be honest, the language that we speak with in academia, it really is ununderstandable to most people, unfortunately. I try not to speak like that as much as possible, but still, nevertheless, I know it ends up becoming this abstract form because that's how we're trained. But so I would hope maybe using different mediums can help as well. I don't feel I've answered this very well, but it's a really good question. I need to think about it more.
It's good to kind of think about it a little bit more. Thanks for that. We do have some questions online that I was not able to get to, but that's okay. I think we had a very rich discussion. So thank you so much, Ian, for firstly, the 14 years of patchwork ethnography, just to put another academic this thing out there, but but also to not lose the complexity of every single individual that you spoke about today, and you left us a lot to think about. Thank you everybody here and online for some really, really good questions. I think it was a very rich discussion, and I'm still thinking about some of the questions and the answers after this. So thank you so much, and please don't forget to tune in to the next Publics at IIHS lecture series. Hopefully we will continue to have such good conversations. Thank you.